Now, we shall leave off the refutation of Gorgias's argument that nothing exists. We shall move on to his argument that even if anything exists, nothing could be known. Now, this part of his argument, at least as preserved in the records, is at face value insufficient and seemingly incomplete, almost such as to seem as something not demanding a response, as something not demanding acknowledgement. Even the one translator notes that the whole of this passage is unsatisfactory, and so on. But I think I have offered a rather faithful interpretation that does hold a great deal of weight. That shows that the argument does hold a great deal of weight and does have to be addressed and either refuted or should require a qualification of our position. The argument as preserved runs thus: even if anything exists, whatever that is could not be known. For otherwise, all objects of thought must exist, all objects of cognition must exist, and non-being could not be thought of, or falsehood could not be thought of, so that nothing could be false. Now, the obvious response, which I think all would hold, is that the possibility of knowledge doesn't or shouldn't imply that all thought should have to amount to knowledge, such as that there could not be a thought which is not of something true. There could not be a false thought. And so the argument doesn't seem to require serious consideration. But if we contextualize the argument as targeting, as having the target of Parmenides' claim that it is the same thing to be thought and to be. That the object of thought is being, in the unqualified sense, that the faculty of thought, the faculty of thinking, has as its object being in the unqualified sense. And that is what Gorgias is trying to refute. That anything thought simply is, not because it is thought, but because there is a sort of mutual dependency or natural relation between thinking and being. And Gorgias's argument becomes then something that has to be given a serious consideration. And I add an analogy in order to illustrate that, to add a sort of finality to his argument. And that is this. First of all, we must say that there must be some object of thought. Parmenides had said that that is being, unqualifiedly, and just per se being, simply being in the unqualified sense as the object of thought. There must be some object of thought. Gorgias's argument, and I think this is really his meaning, is that if being is the object of thought, in the same sense that sound is the object of hearing, or that the visible or perhaps color is the object of sight, then since all hearing is the hearing of sound, and nothing that is not sound can be heard, so also everything that is thought would have to be. Everything that is thought would have to be, and nothing that is not being could be thought. Nothing that is false could be thought. Or as everything that is seen is what is visible, everything that is seen is visible, or perhaps we might say color. Everything that is seen is color or visible, and nothing that is not color or is not visible can be seen. So also, if being is the object of thought as the visible is the object of sight, then everything that is thought would be and would be true, and nothing that is not and nothing that is false could be thought. And this only has to be, in order to make sense of Gorgias's argument, first of all, the whole question revolves around the object of thought, and there must be an object of thought. And what he is trying to refute is Parmenides' claim, specifically Parmenides' claim, that the object of thought is being in the unqualified sense. Now, he offers a good refutation of that rather simplistic version of Parmenides' statement, whereas Parmenides does offer more sophisticated versions which seem not to be threatened by that argument, such as that it is impossible to think that what is not is, and it is impossible to think that what is not. And that sort of statement, although slightly already qualified, is what is abstracted by figures like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle from the rest of Parmenides' monism as a sort of principle of logic, of the law of non-contradiction. But indeed, Socrates also claims that the more so something exists, the more so it can be known, or that we can have necessary knowledge of things that are unchanging and permanent, and we cannot have necessary knowledge of things that are changing. Or that things that are permanent and always are the same are absolutely definite. They're definite. Whereas the things that are changing and fleeting or have accidental attributes are things indefinite. And those things cannot be known. That the more so something is, the more so something has a permanent or necessary existence, the more so it can be known. So this is a crucial point for Socrates, which he does have to defend. And Gorgias's argument does bear weight. But perhaps he is only offering a challenge to the more simplistic version of the intelligibility of being as presented in perhaps a choice statement of Parmenides rather than others. There is nonetheless some intelligibility of being, that being is inherently intelligible, and that the more so something is and necessarily is, the more so it can be known with certainty. And the more so it is definite. That is a position which Socrates has to defend. And that has been pointed out as a crucial point on which a great deal of difficulties result. There was a recent work called Thinking Being that made that point. And I've also heard the same thing said by Keith Woods, that many of the difficulties of modern philosophy, that seemingly irresolvable difficulties, result from a sort of detachment and a distinction between thinking and being, or thought and being, such as that we find the people that argue against materialism, for instance, are somehow arguing for subjectivism, while the materialists or the mechanistic philosophy also claim that everything that is not a mechanistic aspect of material things is subjective, where both sides think that the objects of thought are subjective and are not tied to things. These sort of irresolvable difficulties do result from something near to abandoning what Gorgias is arguing against, which has been called the intelligibility of being. And that is something, and Gorgias's argument is something that has to be taken seriously. And Socrates, as well as all the way to Aristotle also, would say that what is known is the universal. Socrates would say that thinking thinks the universal, that universals are the objects of thought, that the essences of things are the objects of thought, while what is perceived are individual cases. What is perceived are individual cases of the universal, which is the object of thought. So we find that the later thinkers after Parmenides rather qualify his statements or abstract them into the law of non-contradiction or something of this sort. But Gorgias argues a wholesale argument against that position, which is indeed significant. Now, Socrates will be shown to avoid those difficulties by pointing out the limits of the analogy between the object of thought and the objects of hearing and sight. That the objects of hearing and sight and the senses, that hearing and sight receive passively their impressions, that those are passive faculties that merely receive impressions as complete without any active process. Whereas thought is an active process that does not merely receive contents as receiving being, but that thought is a process of combining and separating concepts. And as any process might err, so also thought in combining and separating terms, in predicating one thing of another, in affirming or denying one thing of another, may also err. And again, this was always a sort of paradox which Socrates tended to focus on. That if a thought has to be thought of something, if you cannot think without thinking of something, then how could there be falsehood? How could there be thought of non-being? And that was almost perhaps left as an open question, as that is a difficulty. But if we think of thought as a process of combining and separating terms, of affirming or denying one concept of another concept, of predicating one thing of another, then I think we can get out of the difficulty. Or even when thinking of, say, a triangle, of the essence of triangular, of a triangle in and of itself, we are not holding that isolated concept before our mind as separate from everything else. Even when thinking of triangular and what that is in and of itself, we are not holding before our minds a lone concept as something isolated, but we are affirming or denying other concepts of it. When, for example, we state that triangles are rectilinear, for example, or that triangles are figures, or that triangles are three-sided. We are making explicit the essence of what a triangle is, but only by affirming other concepts of triangle, but which are not separate from triangular, but are as if contained in the concept of triangle, as things logically antecedent or things logically implied in the concept of triangle. When we say that triangles are rectilinear, or triangles are figures, are plane figures, or triangles are three-sided. We have to do that in order to make explicit what the essence of a triangle is and the definition of what a triangle is. We have to affirm other concepts of a triangle. And so the process of thought is combining and separating concepts in that sense. We could not have we have the concept of triangular, but that concept does not make explicit its essence. The essence of triangle is not explicit in the concept, but is perhaps implicit or in a potential state. We have to predicate or affirm or deny other concepts of the concept of triangle in order even to make clear what the essence of the triangle is. Even a triangle in and of itself, we have to combine other concepts. We have to affirm other concepts. So as any process may err, so also may the process of thought. But in a certain sense, we would not admit, and this dialogue goes on to claim, that thought abhors contradiction, that non-being per se cannot be thought, that thought must be of something. You cannot have thought of nothing. You wouldn't have a thought. And also that you cannot think what is contradictory. And that is what Parmenides meant when he said that it is impossible to think that what is not is, and it is impossible to think that what is not. Not only that being cannot not be, or that non-being cannot be, but you cannot even think. Thought will not even permit to think that triangles are curvilinear, for example. That the thought that triangles are curvilinear would cease even to be a thought of triangles, or that circles are rectilinear, would cease even to be a thought of what a circle is, but would be a thought of something else. That thought completely avoids contradiction and unqualified non-being. Falsehood must be some this dialogue does not pass judgment about what falsehood is, but that falsehood at least could not be admitted to thought in the sense of thinking what is contradictory, not explicitly. Then the thought wouldn't even be about the object of thought. So Gorgias' example is, or Gorgias's argument holds rather a great deal of weight for he does offer a difficulty for the position that holds unqualifiedly that the object of thinking is being, or that the object of thought is being. But to the other statement of Parmenides, that is rather connected, it seems less simplistic. That it is impossible to think that what is not is nonetheless valid and unchallenged by Gorgias's argument. For according to that statement, also, if you think that something is, then you cannot at the same time think that it is not what you think it is. In the sense that if you think triangles are rectilinear, you cannot not think they're rectilinear. You cannot think they're not rectilinear and think they're rectilinear in the same sense and at the same time. So Gorgias's argument is very significant, as indeed, if being were the object of thought, and there has to be an object of thought in the sense that sound is the object of the faculty of hearing, and the visible or perhaps color is the object of sight. There has to be something of the sort, not just that being as the universal, or like, not that being per se is the object of thought, as Parmenides, maybe we don't defend him there, if that's what he means. But that thought has to be thought of something, and of something that is. But that thought is not a passive process as hearing and seeing are, but requires affirming or denying one concept of another. That is what it is to think, is to predicate something of something else. And Socrates would say that thought is of universals. That sight, we see particulars, which are particular instances of the same thing we think. That even if we predicate something of a particular, we are predicating a universal in all cases. If we say a sword is sharp, or this sword is sharp. Sharp, we are predicating as a universal. Or if we say that this fire is hot. Hot is a universal. But that wouldn't even amount to knowledge. Socrates would also say that the only thing that would amount to knowledge would be a definition of a universal. That all fire or that fire simply is luminous and moves upward and is hot, or is something of the sort. And more than that, we would also say that thought has as its target being. We might not say, we might qualify that to mean the target of thought. That thought inquires after what something is. And that is more so knowledge than knowledge that something is of such and such a quality, or of such and such a magnitude, or of such and such a place. That thought harkens forth to the definition of what something is. And that of a particular, that will always be a kind of thing. That will always be a universal. What is this? This is a chariot. Chariot is a universal. And is where the essence of a particular chariot is. We would say, what is a chariot? And the definition would be of a universal. Then that would amount to knowledge. What is also said in this portion of the dialogue is that sight is the sight of color. We see a color of something, but we don't see what the color is the color of. We don't see the thing in itself, not even the particular thing in itself. We don't see what the color is the color of. We see an aspect. And we hear another aspect, but not the thing itself. We hear sound. We hear the sound of something, but we don't hear what the sound is the sound of. Whereas thought is the only thing that attains to the thing itself, as well as inquires after what the definition of something is. I don't know if there is more to say about that. We have to first and foremost defend the position which Gorgias is arguing against, of the intelligibility of being, that the more so something is, the more so it can be known. And things that have a permanent, unchanging existence, such as the objects of geometry, we may have we may have certain knowledge about. Things which are necessarily such, we may have certain knowledge about, but because they are definite. And things that are indefinite and are not necessarily such, we cannot know, or we cannot have certainty about them. But that one overly simplistic statement of Parmenides is very vulnerable to Gorgias's argument. That say it is the same thing to be thought and to be. And would have to be qualified in some sense to be defended. We'd say is the same thing to be known and to be. Or perhaps in another way, but it would have to be qualified. Whereas his other statements regarding the same point are not vulnerable to Gorgias's argument that you cannot, that it is impossible to think that what is not is. Gorgias's argument that we cannot think what is false does not even amount to refuting that claim. We should have to take Gorgias's argument very seriously. But would not amount to I guess the interpretation of Parmenides, it states that you cannot, if you think that something is such and such, you cannot think that it is not such and such. Or that if something is, where you're thinking, if something is, for example, rectilinear, then it cannot not be rectilinear. Or if something is not rectilinear, then it cannot be rectilinear, not in the same sense and not at the same time. Nonetheless, there must be an object of thought in the way that sound is the object of hearing. Not in the sense that we hear sound as we hear just one thing. We hear everything we hear is of the genus of sound. We might hear different sounds. We might think different things. We might think of different things, different beings. But there must be an object of thought, and that has to be being, or at least the object of a certain mode of cognition. Gorgias, mind you, says something to the point of we can think of chariots racing upon the sea, whereby he's talking about imagination. The mode of cognition by which Socrates means that thought conceives universals, or the mode of cognition by which predications are made even. Is different than the imagination. We shouldn't have to defend the chariots racing on the sea. Well, the imagination nonetheless couldn't think something that is contradictory. But Gorgias's argument is significant, is aimed at Parmenides' statement. And that statement is in some manner held by Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, but in a slightly more sophisticated or qualified sense. Though this was always a puzzle for Socrates, how there could be falsehood in thought. If thought must be thought of something, we can't have thought of nothing, else you wouldn't have a thought at all. And Gorgias is he is right that, well, the analogy that I offer to clarify the argument, that if the object of thought is being, in the sense that the object of hearing is sound, and the object of sight is what is visible, color, then as everything heard is sound, and nothing can be heard that is not sound, and as everything seen is color, and nothing that is not color can be seen, so also everything thought would be and would be true, and nothing that is not and is false could be thought. Yet again, we have to maneuver and say that the analogy is true in the sense of, the analogy is valid in the sense of there being an object of each of those, and of thought having an object. And we would assert that the object of thought is being, or the essences of things, or something like that, or universals. But that thought is a process of combining and separating concepts. And any process may err. Yet every process must be able to succeed, else it wouldn't even be a process. Must have some sort of end over which the process is set. So that being is the object of thought in the sense of a target. That thought is aiming towards the essences of things, of definitions of what they are. Thought is asking what something is, what things are, all kinds of things. It is predicating one thing of another, one concept of another concept. Is affirming or denying one concept of another, and not holding one concept, not fixating on one concept, even when thinking in and of that thing in and of itself. Even when thinking of man, or what man is in and of itself, the concept of animal is predicated of it. The concept of animal is affirmed and asserted of the concept of man, when we say that man is an animal. And that when we say that animals are self-moving. And then we say that since animals are self-moving and humans are animals, then humans also are self-moving. Or when we say that humans are two-footed, animals, or rational animals, or wingless bipeds. Or when we say that birds are two-footed with wings. When we are trying to define what these things are, we are affirming one concept of another concept. But the predicate as being contained in the subject, as being logically antecedent. I think I made my point clear. And I will continue in another video to read this portion of the dialogue.